The fluorescent lights hummed softly in the pediatric ward, casting their sterile glow across linoleum floors that had witnessed countless stories of hope and heartbreak. It was just after dawn when the hospital's automatic doors slid open, and something extraordinary began to unfold, something that would soon capture the hearts of millions around the world. In room 314, the morning stillness was broken only by the rhythmic beeping of medical monitors and the quiet whisper of ventilation systems. 8-month-old Noah lay swaddled in soft blue blankets, his tiny chest rising and falling in shallow breaths beneath a network of tubes and wires. His mother, Sarah, sat in the chair beside his crib, her eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights and endless tears. She hadn't left his side in 3 days. The doctor had delivered the news she'd been dreading for months. There was nothing more they could do. Noah's rare genetic condition had progressed beyond any treatment modern medicine could offer. Now it was only a matter of time, perhaps hours, perhaps a day. The words had shattered something inside her that could never be repaired, but Sarah had made one final request, one that had taken every ounce of courage she had left. She'd asked to see Max. Max was their German shepherd, a magnificent dog with a coat of rich black and tan, intelligent amber eyes, and a heart that seemed to understand things no animal should be able to comprehend. From the moment Noah had come home from the hospital as a newborn, Max had appointed himself the baby's guardian. He would lie beside the crib for hours, his ears perked at every sound, his eyes watching over the infant with unwavering devotion. As Noah grew, so did their bond. When Noah laughed, Max's tail would wag with pure joy. When Noah cried, Max, who would press his nose against the crib bars and whine softly, as if trying to soothe him. Sarah had captured hundreds of photos of them together, Max's large head resting gently beside Noah's tiny body, the baby's fingers tangled in the dog's fur, both of them peaceful and content. But then Noah had gotten sick. It started with fevers that wouldn't break, a refusal to eat, and a weakness that seemed to drain the light from his eyes. The hospital visits became more frequent. The tests multiplied. The diagnoses grew more serious. Through it all, Max never left Noah's side when the baby was home. He would rest his broad head on the edge of Noah's bed, his eyes tracking every movement, every breath. The day the ambulance came for the final time, Max had known something was terribly wrong. Sarah would never forget the sound he made as the paramedics carried Noah out on a stretcher, a deep, mournful howl that seemed to come from somewhere ancient and primal. Max had tried to follow, but Sarah's husband had held him back, tears streaming down his own face as he gripped the dog's collar. But Max wouldn't be held for long. Within an hour, he'd escaped through an unlocked gate and run the 3 miles to St. Mary's Hospital. Security cameras later showed him arriving just as the sun was setting, his fur matted with sweat, his tongue hanging from the run. He'd positioned himself at the main entrance and refused to move. For 3 days, Max waited. Hospital staff tried everything. They brought him food he wouldn't eat. They brought him water he barely drank. They tried to coax him away, to call animal control, to contact his family. Nothing worked. Max stayed, his eyes fixed on those automatic doors, his body tense and alert, waiting for the moment he could reach Noah. Rain came on the second night, cold and unrelenting. Max didn't seek shelter. He simply sat there, water streaming down his fur, his eyes never leaving the entrance. Nurses coming off their shifts would pause and look at him, some with pity, others with a strange kind of reverence. One nurse, an older woman named Margaret who'd worked in pediatrics for 30 years, brought him a blanket. Max accepted it, but didn't move from his post. By the 3rd morning, Max's vigil had become something of a legend in the hospital. Staff members would check on him between shifts. Patients in rooms overlooking the entrance would watch him from their windows. Some said it was the most loyal thing they'd ever seen. Others said it was heartbreaking. Everyone agreed it was extraordinary. That's when Sarah made her plea. She'd heard about Max from her husband who'd been searching for him frantically. When she learned he was outside, something inside her broke open. She found Dr. Richardson, the pediatrician who'd been treating Noah, and through her tears she begged. "Please," she whispered, her voice raw. "Please let him say goodbye." Dr. Richardson was a man of science, of rules and protocols. Pets weren't allowed in the pediatric ICU under any circumstances. The risk of infection, the disruption to other patients, the liability, there were 100 reasons to say no. But when he looked at Sarah's face, at the desperate hope mingled with unbearable grief, he found he couldn't refuse. "Just this once," he said quietly. "Just for a few minutes." The words spread quickly through the ward. Nurses paused in their rounds. Other doctors stepped back. Even other families, dealing with their own struggles and sorrows, seemed to sense that something profound was about to happen. When Max was finally led through those automatic doors, his transformation was immediate. His exhausted body suddenly surged with energy. His tail began to wag. His eyes, which had been glazed with fatigue, became bright and focused. He knew, somehow he knew he was about to see Noah. The journey to room 314 felt both endless and too short. Max's nails clicked against the polished floor as he walked beside Sarah, his body trembling with anticipation and something deeper, a kind of desperate urgency that seemed to emanate from every fiber of his being. Nurses stepped aside to let them pass, and more than one wiped at their eyes. Dr. Richardson walked ahead, his hand on the door handle. He paused and turned to Sarah. "Are you ready?" he asked softly. She nodded, unable to speak, her hand buried in Max's thick fur, as if drawing strength from him. The door opened. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of medical equipment and the pale morning light filtering through half-closed blinds. The air felt heavy, weighted with the knowledge of what was coming. Noah's crib stood in the center, surrounded by monitors and IV stands, a small island of blue blankets in a sea of medical technology. For a moment, Max stood perfectly still in the doorway, his entire body tense. His ears were forward, his nose working to process the smells antiseptic medication, illness, and underneath it all, the familiar scent of the baby he'd loved since the day he was born. Then he moved, not with his usual boundless energy, but slowly, carefully, as if he understood the fragility of this moment. His paws made almost no sound as he approached the crib. Dr. Richardson stood to the side, his arms crossed, his professional demeanor cracking as he watched. 2 nurses had followed them in, ostensibly to monitor Noah's vitals, but they stood frozen, witnesses to something none of them would ever forget. Max reached the crib and rose up on his hind legs, his front paws resting gently on the railing. His head was level with Noah's now, and for several heartbeats he simply looked at the baby. Noah lay motionless except for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. His skin had taken on a translucent quality, pale and delicate. His eyes were closed, his tiny fists curled loosely at his sides. Tubes ran from his nose, his arm, monitoring every struggling system in his small body. The heart monitor beeped steadily but slowly, each pulse a quiet reminder of how tenuous his hold on life had become. Max made a sound, not quite a whine, not quite a whimper, but something in between. It was a sound of recognition, of grief, of love that transcended words. He lowered his head and pressed his nose gently against Noah's hand, and then something miraculous happened. Noah's fingers moved. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but everyone in the room saw it. His tiny hand, which had been still for hours, twitched and then slowly opened. His fingers stretched out, searching, and found Max's fur. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Noah," she whispered, moving closer. The baby's eyelids fluttered. For days, he'd been unresponsive, lost in whatever space exists between life and death. The doctors had said he probably couldn't hear them anymore, couldn't feel anything. But now, with Max's presence filling the room, something was pulling him back, if only for a moment. Noah's eyes opened, those beautiful gray-blue eyes that Sarah had stared into countless times, memorizing every fleck, every shade. They were unfocused at first, confused, but then they found Max. And Noah smiled. It was a small smile, weak and fleeting, but it was real. His fingers tightened in Max's fur, holding on with whatever strength remained in his tiny body. The heart monitor, which had been beating at a sluggish, irregular pace, suddenly grew stronger, more steady. The beeps came faster, more rhythmic. "Oh my God," one of the nurses whispered, her hand over her heart. Dr. Richardson stepped closer to check the monitors, his scientific mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. There was no medical explanation for this. The condition hadn't changed. His body was still failing, still shutting down, but something in him was responding to Max's presence, rallying for one final, beautiful moment of connection. Max seemed to understand the gift he'd been given. He lowered his head further, resting it on the blanket beside Noah, being careful to avoid the tubes and wires. His amber eyes never left the baby's face. His tail wagged slowly, gently, a metronome of love and devotion. Noah's free hand moved, reaching up with agonizing slowness. His fingers touched Max's ear, then his snout, exploring the familiar textures he'd known his entire short life. A sound escaped his lips, not quite a laugh, but close, a tiny expression of joy or comfort or recognition. Time seemed to stop in that hospital room, surrounded by machines and medicine and all the trappings of modern healthcare. Something ancient and profound was taking place. It was a connection that went deeper than medicine could reach, a bond that existed beyond the physical realm. It was love in its purest form, unconditional, unwavering, transcendent. Sarah knelt beside them, one hand on Max, one hand near Noah, completing the circle. Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time in days, they weren't only tears of grief, they were tears of gratitude. Max had given her this moment, this final gift of seeing her son smile, of watching him respond, of witnessing the bond between them one last time. Max lay his paw gently on the blanket, just beside Noah's leg, as if protecting him, comforting him. He let out a soft whine, a sound so filled with emotion that it broke something open in everyone who heard it. It was goodbye. Somehow, they all knew it. The heart monitor continued its steady rhythm, stronger than it had been in hours. Noah's eyes remained open, fixed on Max, drinking in the sight of his guardian, his protector, his friend. The minutes passed in a strange suspension of reality. Outside the room, the hospital continued its usual rhythm, phones ringing, pages being called, footsteps echoing through corridors. But inside room 314, the world had narrowed to just this: a baby, a dog, and a love that refused to acknowledge the boundary between life and death. Max had positioned himself so that Noah could see him clearly, feel him fully. The dog's breathing had synchronized with the baby's, as if trying to lend him strength through their shared rhythm. Noah's tiny fingers remained tangled in Max's fur, holding on with a grip that seemed impossible for someone so weak. Sarah watched them through a blur of tears, her heart simultaneously breaking and swelling. Her husband had arrived moments earlier, slipping quietly into the room, and now stood behind her with his hands on her shoulders. Neither of them spoke. There were no words adequate for this moment. Dr. Richardson had stopped checking his watch, had stopped thinking about his other patients, his rounds, his responsibilities. He simply stood, witness. This moment reminding him why he'd become a doctor in the first place, not just to treat disease, but to honor the profound mystery of life in all its forms. The nurse named Margaret, who'd brought Max a blanket during his vigil, had positioned herself near the door, her phone discreetly recording. She knew this was something the world needed to see, something that might bring comfort to others facing their own impossible goodbyes. Her hands trembled as she held the phone steady, tears silently tracking down her weathered cheeks. Noah's eyes began to drift closed again, exhaustion claiming him, but his hand didn't release Max's fur. Max, sensing the change, shifted slightly, bringing his face closer to Noah's. He nuzzled the baby's cheek with infinite gentleness, his breath warm against the infant's pale skin. For just a moment, Noah's eyes opened one more time. They found Max's amber gaze, and something passed between them, an understanding, an acknowledgement, a promise made without words. Max's tail wagged twice, slowly, deliberately. Then Noah's hand relaxed, his fingers slipping free from Max's coat. The heart monitor's steady rhythm began to slow, each beep stretching further from the last. Dr. Richardson stepped forward instinctively, but stopped himself. There would be no intervention now, no desperate measures. This was always how this story would end. They could only let it unfold with dignity and love. Max's head lifted slightly, his ears perked forward as if listening to something only he could hear. His eyes never left Noah's face as the baby's breathing became shallower, more spaced. The room held its collective breath, and then, as peacefully as falling asleep in his mother's arms, Noah took one final, gentle breath. The heart monitor's beeping slowed further, wavered, and then collapsed into a sustained tone that seemed to fill every corner of the room. The flat line on the screen was clinical, final, undeniable. Noah was gone. Max knew immediately. His entire body tensed, and then he released a sound unlike anything anyone in that room had ever heard, a deep, wrenching cry that seemed to be torn from the depths of his soul. It wasn't a howl or a bark, but something entirely different, a vocalization of pure grief that transcended species. He stayed frozen beside the crib, his eyes locked on Noah's now still face, as if refusing to accept what his senses were telling him. His paw remained on the blanket, protective even now. For several long moments he didn't move, didn't blink, simply stared at the baby he'd sworn to guard. Sarah collapsed into her husband's arms, her sobs breaking the spell. The sound of human grief joined Max's animal mourning, filling the space with a symphony of loss. Dr. Richardson quietly turned off the monitor, silencing its alarm. Margaret lowered her phone, the recording complete, and wiped at her streaming eyes. The second nurse slipped out to give the family privacy, but not before pausing to rest her hand briefly on Max's head. Finally, Max moved. He lowered himself from the crib slowly, his movements stiff and mechanical. He didn't leave the room immediately, but instead sat beside Sarah, pressing his body against her legs, offering whatever comfort he could, even as his own heart shattered. When it was time to go, when Sarah and her husband had said their final goodbyes and the hospital staff needed to take care of their necessary procedures, Max stood. He walked to the crib one last time and rose up on his hind legs, stretching to see Noah's face once more. He was still, his eyes taking in every detail as if committing it to memory. Then he lowered himself, turned toward the door, and paused. Looking back over his shoulder, he released one final sound, a soft, gentle bark that somehow carried both goodbye and a promise. As Max left room 314 for the last time, his tail low and his head down, every person in that hallway stopped what they were doing. They watched him pass in silence, this dog who had loved so completely, who had kept vigil for 3 days and nights, who had been granted the precious gift of one final goodbye. That night, in a home that felt impossibly empty, Max went to Noah's nursery. He lay down beside the crib now, stripped of its bedding, standing empty and silent, and didn't move for hours. Sarah found him there past midnight, his eyes open, staring at nothing and everything. She lay down on the floor beside him, and together they mourned, two beings who'd loved the same small soul with everything they had. The story could have ended there, in grief and loss and the crushing weight of goodbye, but it didn't. Margaret's video had been meant only for the hospital's internal memory, perhaps to be shared privately with Noah's family someday when the grief wasn't quite so raw. But within hours of her posting it to a closed group for pediatric nurses seeking emotional support, it began to spread. One nurse shared it with another, a doctor sent it to a colleague, someone posted it to social media with a simple caption, This is what love looks like. By morning, it had been viewed 10,000 times. By afternoon, 1,000,000. By the end of the week, over 50 million people around the world had watched Max say goodbye to Noah. Comments poured in from every corner of the globe, in dozens of languages. People shared their own stories of beloved pets who'd stayed by their side during illness, of animals who seemed to possess an understanding that transcended what science could explain. Many simply wrote variations of the same sentiment. I'm crying. This broke my heart. Animals are too pure for this world. News outlets picked up the story. German Shepherd's final goodbye to dying baby moves millions to tears. Read one headline. The most heartbreaking display of loyalty ever captured on camera, proclaimed another. Television programs featured it in special segments about the bond between humans and animals. The video was shared by celebrities, by grieving parents, by anyone who'd ever loved and lost. But the attention felt hollow to Sarah and her husband. They were grateful that Noah's brief life had touched so many, that his story and Max's devotion had moved people, but their grief remained a private, consuming thing. They withdrew from the public eye, focusing on surviving each day, each hour, each breath without their son. Max, too, seemed lost in his grief. He barely ate. His playfulness evaporated. He would wander the house at night, checking rooms as if searching for someone who would never return. The veterinarian confirmed what Sarah already knew: Max wasn't physically ill, but his heart was broken. Then, 3 weeks after Noah's death, something extraordinary happened. It started on an overcast Tuesday morning. Sarah had let Max out into the backyard, expecting him to do his business and return as usual. But when she called for him minutes later, he didn't come. She found the gate ajar. She could have sworn she'd latched eaten Max, nowhere to be seen. Panic set in immediately. She called her husband, called neighbors, began driving through the area searching. An hour passed, then 2. She was about to call the police when her phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Is this Max's owner? A woman's voice asked. The German Shepherd. Yes, do you have him? Is he okay? He's fine, the woman said, and Sarah could hear a smile in her voice. He's at St. Mary's Hospital. You might want to come see this. When Sarah arrived, she found a small crowd gathered near the pediatric wing. At its center was Max, sitting calmly outside the children's ward, his tail wagging gently as a nurse scratched behind his ears. How did he? Sarah began, but Dr. Richardson, who had been called down from his office, interrupted. He just showed up, he said, shaking his head in amazement. Walked right through the main entrance like he belonged here. Security was going to remove him, but then he went straight to the children's ward and, well, you should see. They led her inside, and what she saw made her breath catch. Max was moving slowly down the hallway, stopping at each room. When he reached a doorway, he would pause, look inside, and if there was a baby or young child visible, he would sit. Just sit, his eyes focused on the child, his presence calm and steady. After a minute or two, he would stand and move to the next room. He's been doing this for the last hour, a nurse whispered to Sarah. Some of the parents are amazed. One mother said her daughter stopped crying the moment Max sat by her door. Sarah watched tears streaming down her face as Max completed his rounds. He wasn't frantic or searching in the desperate way she'd expected. His movements were purposeful, deliberate. As if he were on a mission, he'd assigned himself at each crib, each bed. He would pause and rest his head near the child, never touching, always careful of tubes and wires, but close enough for his presence to be felt. Some children reached for him, tiny hands grasping at his fur. Others simply watched with wide eyes. The parents looked on with expressions ranging from confusion to wonder to profound emotion. When Max reached the last room, he sat for several minutes, his eyes on a premature baby in an incubator. The infant's mother stood nearby, her hand pressed against the glass partition, and she was crying. When Max finally stood to leave, she knelt beside him and wrapped her arms around his neck. Thank you, she whispered. I don't know why, but thank you. Dr. Richardson pulled Sarah aside, his expression thoughtful. I've been a pediatrician for 23 years, he said quietly. I've seen a lot of things that science can't quite explain, but this. Sarah, I don't think Max is looking for Noah. Then what is he doing? She asked. I think he's giving what he can't have anymore. I think he's offering comfort because he understands what these families are going through. He's Dr. Richardson paused, choosing his words carefully. He's continuing to be what he was for Noah. A guardian, a comfort, a presence that says you're not alone. That day marked the beginning of something unprecedented in St. Mary's Hospital history. With special permission from the administration and after Max passed a certified therapy dog evaluation, which he completed with remarkable calm and focus, he became an unofficial resident of the pediatric ward. Sarah would bring him 3 times a week, walking through the familiar corridors that had once meant heartbreak but now represented something different, something purposeful. Max had found his calling in the aftermath of loss, and in doing so, had given Sarah a reason to return to the place where she'd said goodbye to Noah. The routine became sacred. Max would enter through the main doors, the same doors where he'd kept his vigil, and make his way to the children's ward with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was needed. He never rushed, never pulled on the leash. He moved with dignity and intention, His presence became transformative in ways that surprised even the most skeptical medical staff. Dr. Richardson began documenting what he was witnessing. Children who Max visited showed measurably reduced stress responses, heart rates stabilized, crying diminished, pain medication requirements sometimes decreased on days when Max made his rounds. It's not magic, Dr. Richardson would explain to curious colleagues and journalists who'd caught wind of Max's new role. It's biochemistry, the simple act of touching an animal, of feeling that non-judgmental presence and unconditional affection, triggers the release of oxytocin and reduces cortisol. But with Max it seems to go beyond that. There's something about his particular manner, his gentleness, his seeming understanding of fragility that makes him exceptional. The parents noticed too. They would share stories in the family waiting room, speaking in reverent tones about the dog who understands. One father, whose 3-year-old daughter was recovering from a serious surgery, swore that she had spoken her first word in days after Max's visit. Dougie, mother whose premature twin sons had been struggling to thrive, said they seemed to breathe easier when Max was near, as if his calm presence assured them the world was safe enough to stay in. But it was the terminal cases, the children who wouldn't recover, who were in their final days or hours, where Max's impact was most profound. With an ability that defied explanation, he seemed to know which children needed him most. He would spend extra time in certain rooms, his visits growing longer, his presence more insistent. Nurses began to recognize the pattern. When Max refused to leave a particular child's bedside, they knew to call the family, to prepare them. He had become an unexpected but accurate harbinger, not of death itself, but of the need for loved ones to gather, to say what needed to be said while there was still time. He's like a bridge. Margaret, the nurse who'd first recorded his goodbye to Noah, explained during a television interview that brought even more attention to Max's work. He helps these families understand that it's okay to be present for the end, that there's beauty and peace possible even in goodbye. He showed us that with Noah, and now he's teaching others. Sarah watched all of this unfold with a complex mixture of emotions. Pride in Max's remarkable gift, gratitude that Noah's legacy was living on in this unexpected way, but also grief that never quite faded, that lived alongside her daily activities like a shadow she'd learned to carry. On the 3-month anniversary of Noah's death, Sarah brought Max to the hospital as usual, but this time, after his rounds, she asked Dr. Richardson if they could visit room 314. The room looked different now. New equipment, different arrangement, the walls a slightly different shade after repainting. A 2-year-old girl recovering from a heart transplant now occupied the space, but Sarah could still see it as it had been, could still see Noah in his crib, Max's head resting beside him, that final smile. Max entered the room and immediately went to the little girl. She was awake, her dark eyes wide as she watched the big dog approach, her mother tensed, protective, until Sarah explained who they were. "This is Max," Sarah said softly. "He's a very special dog." The little girl reached out, and Max moved closer, letting her small hand rest on his head. "Nice doggy," she whispered. Sarah watched, and for the first time in months, felt something other than pain when she thought of Noah. She felt purpose. She felt continuation. She felt that somehow, in some way she couldn't fully articulate, Noah's brief life was still touching the world through Max's presence. That evening, at home, Sarah knelt beside Max and looked into his amber eyes. "You know," she whispered, "I used to think you were searching for him, that you went to that hospital hoping to find Noah again." Max's tail wagged slowly. "But Dr. Richardson was right, wasn't he? You're not searching. You're giving. You're taking all that love you have, all that devotion that doesn't just disappear when someone dies, and you're sharing it with others who need it. You're showing us how to go on." She buried her face in his fur, and Max leaned into her, steady and solid and present. "I think," she continued, her voice muffled, "I think you carry a piece of him with you. Not his body, not his physical presence, but his spirit, his capacity to make people smile even when they're struggling, his ability to bring light into dark places. You're doing what he can't do anymore. Max, you're continuing his story." Max licked her cheek, his tail wagging more enthusiastically now. Sarah pulled back and smiled through her tears. "Okay, boy," she said. "Okay, let's keep going. Let's keep sharing what we learned from him. Let's show the world that love doesn't end with goodbye." The story of Max and Noah spread far beyond St. Mary's Hospital, far beyond the initial viral video that had moved millions to tears. It became a symbol of something profound and universal. That love, once given, doesn't simply vanish when death arrives. It transforms. It continues. It finds new expressions in unexpected places. Max continued his work at the hospital for years, touching thousands of lives in his quiet, gentle way. Children who met him during their darkest hours would later send pictures and letters, showing their recoveries, their returned health, their gratitude for the furry guardian who'd sat with them when they were scared. Parents who'd lost children found comfort in Max's story, in the proof that the bonds we form don't break just because someone leaves. They persist in memory, in action, in the ways we choose to honor what we've lost by giving what we still have. Sarah became an advocate for animal-assisted therapy in pediatric settings. sharing Noah and Max's story at medical conferences and fundraisers. She helped other hospitals establish similar programs, training therapy dogs and their handlers, creating protocols for end-of-life visits that honored both the dignity of dying children and the healing presence of animals. As Max aged, his visits became less frequent, his energy diminished by time and arthritis. But even in his senior years, he would still insist on his rounds, moving more slowly but with the same purpose, the same gentle understanding in his eyes. When Max finally passed away at the age of 13, surrounded by Sarah's family and with Noah's blue blanket beneath his head, the hospital held a memorial service. Hundreds attended: doctors, nurses, families whose children Max had comforted, strangers who'd been moved by his story. They shared memories of his kindness, his loyalty, his ability to bring peace to impossible situations. Dr. Richardson spoke at the service, his voice thick with emotion. "Max taught us something medicine sometimes forgets," he said, "that healing isn't always about cure. Sometimes it's about comfort. Sometimes it's about presence. Sometimes it's about showing up, even when there's nothing you can fix, and saying through your very presence you are not alone. You are loved. Your pain matters." In the hospital's main lobby, they installed a bronze statue of Max sitting beside a small crib, his head tilted slightly, his eyes gentle and wise. The plaque beneath it read, "In memory of Max, who showed us that love's most powerful form is loyalty that endures beyond goodbye, and in memory of Noah, whose brief life inspired countless acts of compassion." Children passing through the lobby would stop to pet the statue, running their hands over the bronze fur worn smooth by thousands of touches. Parents would pause to read the inscription, some with tears in their eyes, others with small smiles of recognition, because Max and Noah's story wasn't really about death, though death was part of it. It wasn't about sadness, though sadness ran through it like a thread. It was about the truth that we sometimes forget in our grief-stricken moments, that love is stronger than loss, that connection survives separation, that the best way to honor what we've loved and lost is to continue loving, continue giving, continue showing up for others in their darkest hours. Max proved that loyalty doesn't end with goodbye. He demonstrated that sometimes love continues in the quietest ways, in a gentle presence, in a calm sitting with, in the simple act of showing up when someone needs you most. His story, and Noah's story, reminds us all that the bonds we form in love create ripples that extend far beyond what we can see or measure. That a baby who lived only 8 months and a dog who mourned him touched millions of lives around the world. That grief, when transformed by purpose, becomes a gift. That hope can grow even in hospital rooms where we're saying goodbye. And perhaps most importantly, they showed us that love, true, deep, unwavering love, doesn't ask for forever. It simply gives everything it has for whatever time it's given, and in doing so, creates a legacy that echoes long after the final goodbye. Max isn't searching for Noah anymore. He never was. He was showing us how to carry those we've lost forward with us, wrapped in fur or held in heart, offering hope wherever it's needed most.